The door creaked open, and Mark Stevens stood frozen, his 5-year-old daughter Emma clutching his leg. His neighbor Sarah's words hung in the air between them. "I know you've been struggling since Lisa died. I found your eviction notice in the mailbox by mistake." Mark's knees buckled as the wall he'd built around his pain crumbled instantly. If this story touches your heart, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more emotional journeys that remind us of the power of human connection. Mark had been barely holding it together for 8 months since his wife's sudden death. The medical bills had drained their savings, and his job as a graphic designer wasn't enough to cover the mortgage on their modest suburban home. He'd been skipping meals to make sure Emma ate properly, hiding his growing desperation behind forced smiles and bedtime stories. Sarah Matthews had lived next door for 3 years. A retired teacher in her 60s with silver-streaked hair and kind eyes that missed nothing, she had watched the young family with quiet affection. She'd brought casseroles after Lisa's funeral, offered to watch Emma occasionally, but had respected Mark's determined self-sufficiency. Until today, when she'd accidentally received his mail and discovered the truth he'd been hiding from everyone. "I don't need help," Mark said automatically, his voice rough with exhaustion. But the dark circles under his eyes and his gaunt face told a different story. Emma looked up at him with her mother's eyes, innocent and trusting, unaware of how close they were to losing everything. Sarah didn't argue. She simply handed him a business card. "My nephew works at the bank that holds your mortgage. He says there are programs for situations like yours, especially with your wife's medical circumstances. He can help restructure everything." Mark stared at the card, emotions warring on his face, pride, desperation, and a flicker of something he hadn't felt in months, hope. "Why would you do this?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Sarah's eyes softened. "Because that's what neighbors do. And because I know what it's like to face the impossible alone." The story of how Mark had reached this breaking point began long before the eviction notice. Lisa's diagnosis had come without warning, stage 4 pancreatic cancer, discovered during a routine checkup. The doctors had given her 6 months. She lasted 4. Mark had watched his vibrant, laughing wife wither away, trying to shield Emma from the worst of it while maintaining some semblance of normalcy. He'd worked from Lisa's hospital room, laptop balanced on his knees, taking client calls in hushed tones while she slept. Emma would sit beside him, coloring pictures for her mommy that gradually covered every inch of the sterile walls. The night Lisa died, she'd made him promise 2 things, to make sure Emma remembered her, and to find happiness again. "Don't let grief swallow you whole," she'd whispered, her one strong hand barely able to squeeze his. "She needs you to be whole." He'd nodded, tears streaming down his face, making promises he had no idea how to keep. And then she was gone, leaving him with a 4-year-old daughter, a mountain of medical debt, and a hollowness that seemed to expand with each passing day. The funeral expenses had depleted what little savings they had left. Mark had sold their second car, then Lisa's jewelry, except for her wedding ring, which he kept in a small box on his nightstand. He'd cancelled cable, internet, his gym membership, anything non-essential. But it wasn't enough. The mortgage payments fell behind, 1 month, then 2, then 3. He'd hidden the late notices from everyone, his parents who lived across the country, Lisa's sister who called weekly to check on Emma, his friends who had gradually stopped inviting him places when he always declined. Pride kept him silent, along with a deep-seated fear that admitting he couldn't manage would somehow mean he was failing Lisa's memory. Emma had adapted to their new reality with the resilience of childhood, though she still asked for her mother every night before bed. Mark would tell her stories about Lisa, how she could name every constellation in the sky, how she sang off-key but with complete abandon, how she could make friends with anyone within minutes of meeting them. Sometimes, these stories were the only thing that got him through the day. The morning Sarah had found the eviction notice, Mark had been sitting at the kitchen table, staring at job listings. His freelance work had dried up in recent months, the economic downturn had hit the design industry hard, and clients were cutting back on non-essential services. He needed something more stable, something with benefits, but every application he sent seemed to disappear into the void. Emma had been playing with her cereal, arranging the colorful loops into patterns on the table. "Daddy, can we go to the park today?" she'd asked, looking up with hopeful eyes. "Not today, sweetheart," he'd answered automatically. The gas tank was nearly empty, and he needed to save it for job interviews. "Maybe we can play in the backyard later." Her small face had fallen, but she'd nodded with an acceptance that broke his heart. She'd grown used to hearing, "not today," and, "maybe later," phrases that had become his mantras as their world contracted around them. The doorbell had rung then, and Mark had opened it to find Sarah standing there, concern etched on her face and the eviction notice in her hand. Now, standing in his doorway with Sarah's nephew's business card clutched in his trembling fingers, Mark felt something crack inside him. The weight he'd been carrying alone for so long suddenly seemed too heavy to bear. "Emma, honey," he said, kneeling down to his daughter's level. "Why don't you go get your coloring books? Maybe Ms. Sarah would like to see your new pictures." Emma nodded eagerly and ran off to her room, leaving the adults alone. "I don't know how to do this," Mark admitted, his voice breaking. "I don't know how to be both parents. I don't know how to keep our home. I don't know how to make her happy when I can barely function myself." Sarah stepped inside and closed the door behind her. "You don't have to know all at once," she said gently. "And you don't have to do it alone." That conversation marked the beginning of Mark's slow journey back from the brink. Sarah's nephew, David, turned out to be a compassionate loan officer who helped Mark apply for a hardship program that temporarily reduced his mortgage payments. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it bought him time, the most precious commodity for a drowning man. Sarah introduced Mark to a support group for young widowers, something he would have scoffed at before but now clung to like a lifeline. Listening to others share stories of loss and gradual healing gave him permission to acknowledge his own pain without feeling like he was surrendering to it. Through the group, he met Miguel, who ran a successful web design company and was looking to hire someone part-time with the potential for growth. The hours were flexible, the pay decent, and Miguel, who had lost his partner to cancer 3 years earlier, understood Mark's need to prioritize Emma. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, things began to improve. Mark started accepting Sarah's offers to watch Emma occasionally, giving him time to work or simply breathe. He reconnected with friends, initially just for coffee or a quick lunch, gradually expanding to weekend activities that included Emma. 6 months after Sarah had appeared at his door with the eviction notice, Mark stood in his kitchen making dinner, actual dinner, not just microwaved nuggets or cereal, while Emma chatted about her day at kindergarten. The refrigerator was full, the bills were paid, and while grief still visited him regularly, it no longer consumed his every waking moment. The doorbell rang, and Emma raced to answer it, knowing it would be Sarah coming for their weekly dinner. Mark followed more slowly, wiping his hands on a dish towel. He watched as his daughter threw her arms around the older woman's legs, chattering excitedly about the butterfly they'd seen in the garden that morning. Sarah looked up and met Mark's eyes over Emma's head, her smile warm and knowing. They had developed a comfortable routine, these dinners, sometimes at Mark's house, sometimes at Sarah's. Emma adored her, soaking up the grandmotherly attention and stories about the olden days when Sarah had been a teacher. "Something smells wonderful," Sarah said, hanging her sweater on the coat rack, a gesture so familiar now it seemed she'd been doing it forever. "Lasagna," Mark replied. "Lisa's recipe." He said it without the usual stab of pain, just a gentle ache of remembrance. Sarah's eyes widened slightly. "That's a first." Mark nodded. He'd avoided cooking any of Lisa's recipes since her death, unable to face the memories they evoked. But today, he'd pulled out her handwritten recipe book and chosen her signature dish, the one she'd made for every special occasion. "It felt right," he said simply. Later, after Emma had been tucked into bed with her favorite stuffed rabbit and 3 bedtime stories, Mark and Sarah sat on the back porch with cups of tea, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. I got a call from Miguel today, Mark said, breaking the comfortable silence. He wants to make me a full partner in the business. Said my client retention rate is the highest he's ever seen. Sarah beamed at him. That's wonderful, Mark. You deserve it. He shook his head, still amazed at how much had changed. A year ago, I couldn't imagine surviving, let alone thriving. I was so lost. You found your way, Sarah said. With a little help, but mostly through your own strength. Mark turned to look at her, this woman who had become such an essential part of their lives. Why did you do it? Why did you get involved when you could have just minded your own business? Sarah was quiet for a moment, her eyes distant with memory. When my husband died 20 years ago, I had no children, no nearby family. I was teaching full-time and barely keeping my head above water. My neighbor, an older gentleman named Frank, noticed I wasn't collecting my mail. He checked on me and found me in pretty bad shape. She sipped her tea before continuing. Frank brought me soup, made sure I ate, drove me to work when I couldn't trust myself behind the wheel. He saved me, in every way that matters. Before he passed away 5 years later, I promised him I'd pay it forward. Mark felt a lump form in his throat. Well, consider your debt paid in full. Sarah smiled and shook her head. That's not how it works. Now it's your turn to notice when someone else is drowning. The conversation stayed with Mark long after Sarah had gone home. He thought about it as he checked on Emma, sleeping peacefully with her dark curls spread across the pillow. He thought about it as he washed the dinner dishes and prepared Emma's lunch for the next day. He thought about it as he finally allowed himself to look at the framed photo of Lisa on the mantel, really look at it, without feeling like his chest would cave in. 2 weeks later, Mark noticed a moving truck in the driveway of the house across the street. A woman about his age was directing the movers, a toddler balanced on her hip and exhaustion evident in every line of her body. As he watched, the little boy began to cry, and the woman's shoulders slumped in defeat. Before he could second-guess himself, Mark called Emma, and they walked across the street together. "Hi," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Mark Stevens, and this is my daughter Emma. We live across the street. Can we help?" The woman looked at him with wary surprise, bouncing her crying son automatically. "I'm Jenna," she said after a moment. "And this is Lucas. He's overtired and hungry, and I can't find the box with his snacks, and the movers are asking questions I don't have answers to because my husband was supposed to be here but his flight was delayed, and," she stopped abruptly, seeming embarrassed by her outburst. Mark smiled, remembering his own overwhelm. "Emma and I just made lunch. Nothing fancy, just sandwiches and fruit, but you're welcome to join us. Give Lucas a chance to rest a bit while the movers do their thing." Jenna hesitated, then looked at her son's tear-streaked face. "That would be really nice, actually. Thank you." As they walked back across the street, Emma chattering happily to Lucas who had stopped crying to listen, Mark felt something settle in his chest. He thought of Sarah, of Frank before her, of the invisible threads that connected people in moments of need. That evening, he called Sarah to tell her about the new neighbors. "I invited them for dinner tomorrow," he said. "Thought you might want to join us." He could hear the smile in her voice when she answered. "I wouldn't miss it." 1 year to the day after Sarah had appeared at his door with the eviction notice, Mark stood in his living room surrounded by friends. Emma was playing a complicated game of her own invention with Lucas and 2 other children from her class. Miguel and his new boyfriend were deep in conversation with Mark's sister-in-law, who had flown in for the weekend. Jenna and her husband Tom, now good friends, were helping Sarah bring out trays of food from the kitchen. It wasn't a formal occasion, just a gathering of the people who had become Mark's community, his support system, his extended family. But as he looked around at the full room, at Emma's happy face, at the home they had come so close to losing, he felt a profound sense of gratitude. Later, as the party wound down and guests began to leave, Sarah pulled Mark aside. "I have something for you," she said, pressing a small box into his hand. Inside was a key on a simple silver keychain. Mark looked at her questioningly. "It's to my house," she explained. "I've had a spare key to yours since last year, for emergencies. Thought it was time you had one to mine." Mark closed his fingers around the key, understanding the significance of the gesture. "Thank you," he said simply. Sarah patted his arm. "You're doing well, Mark. Lisa would be proud." For once, the mention of his late wife didn't bring pain, only a warm remembrance. "I think she would," he agreed. After everyone had gone and Emma was asleep, Mark sat on the back porch alone, looking up at the stars as he often did when he wanted to feel close to Lisa. The past year had taught him that grief wasn't something to overcome or defeat, it was something to carry, its weight gradually shifting from unbearable to manageable as new joys and connections entered his life. He thought about the day Sarah had found the eviction notice, how close he had come to turning her away, to continuing his solitary struggle until it broke him completely. One small act of neighborly concern had altered the course of not just his life, but Emma's too. The next morning, Mark woke early and made coffee. Emma was still asleep, her room a testament to their improving circumstances, new books on the shelves, art supplies neatly organized, a proper desk for homework when she started first grade in the fall. He sat at the kitchen table with his laptop, opening a new document. For months, his support group leader had been encouraging members to write about their experiences, suggesting that sharing their stories might help others facing similar challenges. Mark had resisted, unsure if he had anything worthwhile to say. But now, fingers hovering over the keyboard, he found the words beginning to flow. "A year ago, I opened my front door to find my neighbor holding an eviction notice. What she said next broke me, but in breaking, I finally began to heal." He wrote through the morning, pausing only when Emma padded into the kitchen in her pajamas, rubbing sleep from her eyes. He made her breakfast, listening to her plans for the day with a full heart, then returned to his writing while she watched cartoons. By the time he finished, the sun was high in the sky. He read through what he'd written, making small edits here and there, then attached it to an email addressed to his support group leader. "This is my story," he wrote in the message. "If it helps even one person feel less alone, then sharing it is worth it." He hit send, then closed his laptop. Emma looked up from her show. "Can we go to the park today, Daddy?" Mark smiled, remembering all the times he'd had to say no. "Absolutely," he said. "Let's pack a picnic." As they gathered supplies in the kitchen, Mark glanced out the window to see Sarah in her garden, tending to her roses. She looked up and waved, and he waved back, grateful beyond words for the day she decided to knock on his door. Emma tugged at his hand. "Can we invite Ms. Sarah to come with us?" "That's a great idea," Mark said. "Why don't you go ask her while I finish packing?" He watched through the window as his daughter skipped across the lawn to where Sarah knelt among her flowers. He saw the older woman's face light up at whatever Emma was saying, saw her nod and ruffle Emma's hair affectionately. In that moment, Mark understood that the true gift Sarah had given him wasn't the financial help or the practical support, though those things had been crucial. It was the reminder that human connection was essential, that vulnerability could be a strength, and that sometimes, the simple act of opening a door could change everything. As Emma ran back to report that Sarah would indeed join them after she changed her gardening clothes, Mark felt a sense of peace settle over him. The grief would always be there, a shadow that sometimes lengthened and sometimes receded, but it no longer defined him. He had found a way to honor Lisa's memory while still moving forward, to be the father Emma needed while also taking care of himself. Sarah joined them for their picnic, bringing along homemade cookies that Emma declared were almost as good as Mommy's used to be, a comparison that once would have pierced Mark's heart but now felt like a precious connection between past and present. They spent the afternoon at the park, Emma racing between the swings and the slide, her laughter carrying on the spring breeze. As the sun began to set, they packed up their things and walked home together, Emma between them, holding both their hands and occasionally swinging herself forward with childish delight. "I'm thinking of starting a neighborhood support network," Mark said as they neared their street. "Nothing formal, just a way for people to ask for help when they need it. Childcare swaps, meal trains for new parents or people going through tough times, that sort of thing." Sarah nodded approvingly. "That's a wonderful idea. I know the Hendersons 2 streets over are struggling with their son's medical issues. And the new family that moved in last month has twins and looks perpetually exhausted." "Exactly," Mark said. "I was thinking we could start small, maybe just our block, and see how it goes." "Count me in," Sarah said. "I've got plenty of time and a freezer full of casseroles." By the time Emma started first grade that fall, the neighborhood network had grown to include 20 families. They had a simple system, a private online group where people could post needs or offers of help, and monthly potlucks that rotated between houses. Mark had designed a logo and website, using his professional skills to give the grassroots effort a polished presence. The first time he received a tearful thank you from a young mother whose husband was deployed overseas and whose baby had been sick for days, Mark understood what Sarah had meant about paying it forward. The relief in the woman's eyes when volunteers showed up to help with laundry, groceries, and giving her a few hours to sleep was a mirror of what he must have looked like when Sarah had stepped in to help him. On Emma's 6th birthday, they hosted a party in the backyard. The weather was perfect, the cake, store-bought, as Mark had learned his limitations, was a hit, and Emma was surrounded by friends from school and the neighborhood. Mark watched her blow out the candles, her wish a solemn secret, and felt Lisa's absence like a physical ache, but alongside it, gratitude for how far they had come. Later, after the guests had gone and Emma was playing with her new toys, Sarah helped Mark clean up the party debris. "I got a call from my nephew at the bank yesterday," she said casually, gathering paper plates. "He mentioned your mortgage is now completely current, and you've even started making additional principal payments." Mark nodded, a small smile playing at his lips. "Miguel made me a full partner last month. The business is doing really well." "I'm proud of you," Sarah said simply. Mark paused in his cleanup efforts, looking at this woman who had become family in every way that mattered. "I couldn't have done it without you." Sarah shook her head. "You would have found a way. You're stronger than you know." "Maybe," Mark conceded. "But I'm glad I didn't have to find out." That night, after tucking Emma in with her new stuffed unicorn, Mark sat on the edge of his bed and opened the small box on his nightstand. Lisa's wedding ring gleamed in the soft lamplight, a circle of gold that had once represented their unbroken love. For the first time since her death, he took it out and held it in his palm, feeling its weight. For so long, he had kept it hidden away, unable to look at it without being overwhelmed by loss. Now, he studied it thoughtfully, remembering the day he had slipped it onto her finger, the promises they had made, the life they had built together. After a moment, he went to his dresser and found a simple silver chain. He threaded Lisa's ring onto it, then fastened it around his neck, feeling the metal warm against his skin. It felt right somehow, carrying her with him, close to his heart, but no longer locked away in darkness. The next morning, Emma noticed the chain immediately. "What's that, Daddy?" she asked, pointing to the ring visible beneath his t-shirt. Mark lifted it out to show her. "It's Mommy's wedding ring. I thought it was time to bring it out of the box." Emma touched it reverently. "It's pretty. Can I wear it someday?" "When you're older," Mark promised. "For now, I'll keep it safe." She nodded, satisfied, then asked for pancakes for breakfast, the moment of solemnity passing as quickly as it had come. Mark marveled at her resilience, her ability to integrate her mother's memory into her life without being weighed down by it, a lesson he was still learning. As summer turned to fall and then to winter, Mark continued to build his new life. The design business thrived, allowing him to put money aside for Emma's college fund and even take her on a small vacation to the beach. The neighborhood network expanded to include 3 adjacent blocks, with regular events and an increasingly organized system for matching needs with volunteers. Sarah remained a constant presence, though she gently encouraged Mark to widen his social circle. "You're young," she reminded him. "You should be meeting people your own age." Mark knew what she was suggesting, but the thought of dating still felt foreign, almost disloyal. "I'm not ready," he told her. "Maybe someday, but not yet." Sarah didn't push, but she did invite a variety of people to their gatherings, including Jenna's sister Alicia, a pediatric nurse with a quick laugh and kind eyes who had recently moved to town. Mark found her easy to talk to, and they developed a comfortable friendship that occasionally made him wonder if there might someday be more. 2 years after Sarah had found the eviction notice, Mark's story, the one he'd written for his support group, was published in a national magazine. The editor had reached out after seeing it on the support group's website, asking permission to share it with a wider audience. Mark had agreed, hoping it might help others in similar situations. The response was overwhelming. Emails poured in from single parents across the country, thanking him for articulating their struggles and giving them hope. A local news station asked to interview him about the neighborhood network, which had by then grown into a model that other communities were beginning to replicate. "You're becoming quite the celebrity," Sarah teased after the news segment aired. Mark shook his head, embarrassed by the attention. "I just told the truth about what happened to me. And the network was a group effort." "Sometimes telling the truth is the most powerful thing we can do," Sarah said. "Especially when it comes to grief and struggle. People need to know they're not alone." On the 3rd anniversary of Lisa's death, Mark took Emma to the cemetery. It was a tradition they had established, bringing flowers, telling stories about Lisa, having a small picnic on the grass near her headstone. In previous years, it had been a somber occasion, heavy with loss. This time, there was still sadness, but also a sense of peace. Emma arranged her bouquet of daisies, Lisa's favorite, carefully against the stone. "I got an A on my science project," she told the headstone matter-of-factly. "We had to grow plants in different conditions. Mine grew the tallest." Mark listened as she continued her one-sided conversation, updating her mother on everything from her new best friend to the loose tooth she was hoping would fall out soon. There was no awkwardness in her manner, no sense that she found it strange to talk to a stone. In her child's mind, this was simply how she connected with the mother she barely remembered but knew through stories and photographs. When she finished, she looked up at Mark. "Your turn, Daddy." Mark knelt beside the grave, placing his own flowers, white roses, next to Emma's daisies. "Hey, Lise," he said softly. "We're doing okay. Better than okay, actually. Emma's growing so fast, she has your smile and your stubbornness." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I'm keeping my promises. She knows you, as much as possible. And I'm finding happiness again, in ways I never expected." He talked for a few minutes more, aware of Emma listening but not minding. There were no secrets here, just the simple truth of their lives continuing without Lisa physically present but with her memory woven into the fabric of their days. As they walked back to the car, Emma slipped her hand into his. "Daddy, do you think Mommy can hear us when we talk to her?" Mark considered the question carefully. "I don't know for sure," he said honestly. "But I like to think that somehow, she knows we're okay and that we still love her very much." Emma nodded, satisfied with his answer. "Ms. Sarah says people we love are never really gone as long as we remember them." "Ms. Sarah is very wise," Mark said, smiling at his daughter's casual mention of the woman who had changed their lives. That evening, they had dinner at Sarah's house, a tradition they had established for this difficult anniversary. She never mentioned what day it was, simply provided comfort in the form of good food and gentle conversation, creating a buffer between the cemetery visit and their return home. As they were leaving, Sarah handed Mark an envelope. "This came for you today," she said. "I signed for it when you were out." Mark opened it after Emma was in bed, curious about the official-looking letterhead. It was from a national foundation that supported programs for families in crisis. They had heard about the neighborhood network through the magazine article and wanted to offer a grant to help expand it to other communities. The amount made Mark's eyes widen. It was enough to hire a part-time coordinator, create proper materials, and provide seed funding for several new neighborhood groups. There was also an invitation to speak at their annual conference about the model he had helped create. He called Sarah immediately, despite the late hour. "Did you have anything to do with this?" he asked when she answered. "With what?" she asked, sounding genuinely confused. He explained about the grant, and he could hear her smile through the phone. "That's wonderful, Mark. And no, I had nothing to do with it. This is all because of what you built." "What we built," he corrected her. "I wouldn't be here without you." "You give me too much credit," she said. "All I did was knock on a door. You're the one who opened it." The metaphor wasn't lost on Mark. Opening doors, to help, to connection, to new possibilities, had become the theme of his rebuilt life. The following spring, Mark stood at a podium in a hotel ballroom, looking out at hundreds of faces. The conference organizers had asked him to deliver the keynote address, sharing the story of how a single act of neighborly concern had sparked a movement that now included dozens of community networks across 3 states. He had prepared carefully, working with Miguel to create a presentation that explained the practical aspects of the model. But as he began to speak, he set aside his notes, deciding instead to tell the simple truth of his experience. "For years ago," he began, "I was a broken man trying desperately to hide it. My wife had died, leaving me with a young daughter, overwhelming debt, and a grief so profound I could barely function. I was weeks away from losing our home, skipping meals so my daughter could eat, and convinced that asking for help was a form of failure." The room was silent, every person leaning forward slightly, caught by the raw honesty in his voice. Then my neighbor knocked on my door. She had found my eviction notice in her mailbox by mistake. What she said broke me, but in breaking, I finally began to heal. He told them about Sarah, about the support group, about Miguel and the job that had saved his financial future. He explained how these experiences had inspired the neighborhood network, and how that grassroots effort had grown beyond anything he could have imagined. "The most important thing I've learned," he concluded, "is that community isn't just a nice addition to our lives, it's essential to our survival. We are not meant to carry our burdens alone. And sometimes, the simple act of noticing someone else's struggle and reaching out can change everything." The applause was thunderous. People rose to their feet, many wiping away tears. Mark stood there, overwhelmed by the response, thinking of how far he had come from that desperate man who had opened the door to find Sarah standing there with his eviction notice. Afterward, a line formed of people wanting to speak with him. He listened to their stories, of loss, of struggle, of communities coming together. He exchanged contact information, promised to share resources, accepted heartfelt thanks with humility. By the time he returned to his hotel room, he was exhausted but filled with a sense of purpose stronger than anything he had felt since Lisa's death. He called home to check on Emma, who was staying with Sarah for the weekend. "She's fine," Sarah assured him. "We baked cookies and watched movies." "How did your speech go?" "Better than I expected," Mark said. I think Lisa would be proud." "I know she would be," Sarah said softly. When he returned home the next day, Emma ran to meet him, throwing herself into his arms with the unrestrained joy of childhood. Over her shoulder, he saw Sarah watching them with a smile, and beyond her, Jenna waving from her front yard, Lucas playing nearby. This was his life now, still marked by Lisa's absence, but full in ways he never could have imagined in those dark days after her death. He had learned that grief and joy could coexist, that vulnerability could be a strength, and that sometimes, the most profound acts of courage were simply opening a door and saying, "I need help." 5 years to the day after Sarah had found his eviction notice, Mark stood in his backyard surrounded by friends and neighbors. Emma, now 10, was helping younger children with an art project at a table under the oak tree. Sarah, moving more slowly these days but still sharp as ever, was deep in conversation with Miguel and his now husband. Jenna and Tom were manning the grill, while Alicia, who had indeed become more than a friend over the past year, organized the potluck contributions on a long table. It wasn't a formal anniversary celebration, most people there didn't even know the significance of the date. But Mark knew, and Sarah knew, and that was enough. As the afternoon sun filtered through the leaves, casting dappled shadows across the gathering, Mark found himself standing beside Sarah, watching the scene with quiet contentment. "Did you ever imagine this?" he asked her, gesturing to the yard full of people, the thriving community they had built together. Sarah smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "Not specifically," she admitted. "But I always believed you had it in you to rebuild your life. You just needed a little help remembering who you were." Mark nodded, understanding what she meant. The grief had temporarily buried his essential self, the loving father, the creative professional, the good friend and neighbor. Sarah hadn't changed him, she had simply helped him find his way back to himself. As the sun began to set and people gradually departed, Mark stood at his front door, saying goodbye to the last guests. Emma had already gone inside with Alicia to get ready for bed, tired from a day of play and socializing. Sarah was the last to leave, pausing on the porch to give him a hug. "I'm proud of you," she said, the words simple but weighted with years of shared history. "Thank you," Mark said, knowing she would understand all he was thanking her for. After she had gone, he closed the door and leaned against it for a moment, thinking about the countless ways a life could be broken and rebuilt. He thought about Lisa, about the promises he had kept and the new joys he had found. He thought about Emma, growing into a compassionate, resilient young person who carried her mother's memory as a strength rather than a burden. And he thought about Sarah, whose simple act of neighborly concern had started a chain reaction that transformed not just his life, but an entire community. The door that had once opened to reveal his deepest shame and vulnerability had become a symbol of possibility, a threshold between isolation and connection, between despair and hope. In opening it, he had found not just help for himself and Emma, but a purpose that honored Lisa's memory in ways he never could have planned. As he moved through the house, turning off lights and checking locks, Mark felt a deep sense of peace. The journey from brokenness to wholeness wasn't a straight line, and there were still difficult days. But he had learned that being broken didn't mean being destroyed. Sometimes, it simply meant being open to being rebuilt in new and unexpected ways. And sometimes, the most important moments in life began with the simple act of opening a door.